Now, we're in the yes, because it's summer. Look at that. Were we doing this in December? No, I don't think so.
I do this in December.
Oh,
Sorry.
Lordy.
Not too
Okay.
much information.
All right. Now, we've started well, actually, next week we'll finish the Solomon stories. Tell me about Solomon. What do we know about King Solomon?
He's a good king.
Okay, he's a good king. What would cause you to say he's a good king?
Because I have it in my notes.
You have it in your notes. Okay, which is good enough.
We discussed this before.
We discussed it before.
Thank you.
Well, what are characteristics of him being a good king? What would be some evidences?
He's a good organizer.
Okay, he's really organized because the writer's given us his cabinet, it's how he's structured. In fact, he's even taken the land and kind of reorganized it administratively, moving away from the old tribal divisions to a slightly different structure in terms of order. So he is well organized.
He
What else?
follows God. He listens to what
Okay.
God has to say. They have a covenant.
Okay, there's a covenant between God and Solomon. Listens to what he has to say. Okay, so he's good politically.
He's respected by the people.
The people respect him. Okay, so he's established himself, and the way he established himself was, on one level you might say it's kind of harsh because he eliminated his opposition, those who would oppose him. But if we look at the stories, and the writer's very careful in writing the story, each person kind of asked for it. It wasn't like Solomon just went out and hunted them down. They kind of asked for it. They either made an arrangement with them that they violated, or they did something else. They pushed the line. We get the sense that Solomon, even when he establishes his kingship, he does it in a way that's just, and he's certainly God's man in this. Okay, what has been the result of this? How would you describe his kingdom? How would you describe Solomon's kingdom to what we know to this place?
He's going to build God's house.
Well, he's going to build the temple. That's what we're going to look at today. Is his kingdom secure?
Yes.
Okay, his kingdom is secure, so it's not. In fact, he even talks about it. There's no enemies anywhere around it. That's why he's able to do the building stuff. Has it expanded? Is it bigger than the area David controlled? Yeah. Yeah, it includes Israel and Judah, and it talks about expanding all the way to the Euphrates. And when you look at a modern map, that's covering a lot of Syria. Damascus is part of, Solomon's kingdom. So this is his kingdom is large. Solomon, and the writer attributes this to God because this is still God's story. Solomon has a reputation. What is Solomon's reputation? He's very wise, and even gave us an example of his wisdom. A little story pointing to his wisdom. Now, the source of his wisdom is God. The writer tells us it's God. So we've got Solomon becomes this example of a good king. Even with that, though, there are a couple of little things that get thrown into the story that might cause you read it and you might not pay much attention to it, but when you see it, you go, by and large, everything is really, really good for Solomon and his kingdom. What are some of those,
Well, in his organization thing, he has somebody over the workforce, and that's the first time we've seen that.
Okay, yeah, we got forced labor, as part of, he's got a whole administrator that handles the forced labor.
And previously we were warned about that.
The king's forced labor because they have to. That's what kings have to do. So, that's really interesting. What's another thing that this is going to be really pertinent next week? Not so much this week, although it's alluded to this week in what we're looking at this week. What else do we have that causes us to go, Now, again, forced labor is what kings do. When they were given the evaluation, Samuel wasn't, I don't think he was suggesting that bad kings force labor. I think he was suggesting all kings. Because if you're going to be king, you're going to need to get things done, and you can't count on volunteers. You're just going to have to get people to build the buildings that kings build, and you're going to have to pay. You're going to have to grow crops for the people that work for the king, and they're going to tax you because none of this is free. So this is just what happens when you got countries. You pay taxes. Your family goes to work for them. They will take your stuff when necessary. That's what kings do. What else did Solomon do that early on that is alluded to, which means the writer must see it as important, but really doesn't mention much about it, but it becomes kind of
He took a wife.
He took a wife. You remember where he took an Egyptian wife, a daughter of Pharaoh, as his wife. Now, why did he do that? Why would Solomon take a wife from the daughter of Pharaoh?
It was to make peace and cohesiveness.
Right. Your father-in-law is probably not going to attack you, and you're not going to attack your father-in-law. You build alliances in the ancient world. In the world up until 100 years ago, you build alliances by having kings marry people from other, royalty from other countries. And that's just what you do. And he does it. Now, we kind of go, because that creates an interesting set of possibilities. What could be an issue with taking foreign wives?
Well, she would still have her beliefs and her God.
Okay, yeah, she's not Jewish. She doesn't worship the God of Israel because she's not an Israelite. So that's a potential problem. We don't know that it is because it doesn't mention it. God doesn't prohibit it, doesn't condemn Solomon for doing it. But it's an interesting, it was put in the story for a reason. I bet you the writer's going to go back to it in the future. And even in what we look at today, he mentions it. I think it's just a reminder to us that she's still around. This gal who's the daughter of Pharaoh is still around. She's still in the picture. So anyway, but to this point, Solomon is in good shape, right? He's an example. And he is going to build the Lord a house. And when we, at the end of chapter 5, he's getting stuff to start building the house. And what is he accumulating in verse 5? What does he do and not verse 5, chapter 5? What is he getting?
Getting cedars.
Okay, he's getting cedar. Okay, and he's got this deal with the king of Tyre, and cedars of Lebanon. That's Tyre's in Lebanon. Going to get the cedar, and he's going to use the cedar to build the house. Now the writer again reminds us that the people who are getting the cedar, they're not volunteers. They're part of forced labor. It's his forced labor that he's using to get it. So I don't think that's the accident that the writer keeps on dropping this in as a reminder that he's doing what kings do. And there's a price for kings. Okay. Anyway, so he's going to start building his house. What begins right at the start of chapter 6? What are we looking at the beginning of chapter 6?
480 years after they left Egypt.
Okay.
They still have the stone tablets that amaze me.
Okay. Still have the stone tablets. 400. Why do you think? And it's not just approximated. They are really specific. Why is it so important, do you think, that the time when they're going to start building this house, why do you think they want to pinpoint it? Why is the writer interested in pinpointing the time? He could have just said, and they started construction. But he wants to put it in a very definite time. Why do you think that? Because when we look at this story, we're going to see a lot of details. You know, the writer's giving us, you might look at it and say, man, this is way more information than I need. Why do you think he's doing that? As the reader, why do you think the writer is giving us this information, all this information, this precise information?
Oh, where's the temple?
Okay, it really shows just how important the temple is. You know, this is one of those pivotal, seminal events. Doesn't pinpoint when Jerusalem becomes a capital, and that's a big deal. Doesn't pinpoint the time when Solomon or David becomes king. Those are important events. But this one, he is nailing to the year. You know, this is a huge, huge deal. And when he starts writing about the temple, he immediately gives us what?
Details.
He gives us details. He gives us dimensions. And when now I don't know what translations you're using, generally they're offered in cubits. Cubits, is that what in the translation you use? Do you know what a cubit is?
No, I'm sure it tells me. When it comes to measurement, it's like, okay.
A cubit is this long. That's a cubit. It's about the length of a man's forearm. From his elbow to the end of his fingers. That's a cubit. Now that makes some sense. Because if you're talking about builders, that means they don't have to carry...
Huge.
Nor do they have to carry measuring tools. You know, they can use their forearm. Just like a foot. You know, where do you get a foot? You know, it makes it a whole lot easier that you don't have to carry rulers with you to do it. You've got something that is standard. So a cubit is about 19 inches. That's about what it is. Maybe a little shorter, maybe 14, 15 inches. Okay, that's so when they're giving that, so it's a little more than a foot. So if you're talking about the dimensions of the temple being 60 cubits long, that's if a cubit is just a hair over a foot, 60 feet is not huge. This is not huge. And that's the length. It's only 20 cubits wide. And 20 cubits, 20 feet, that's not big at all. I mean, this can easily fit on a football field. You know, the temple could easily fit on an American football field. Why do you think this? So this isn't a huge building. Why do you think it's so small? I'll tell you, this Solomon's temple, compared to Herod's temple, the temple in the New Testament, in the Gospel, that was huge. Herod's temple was enormous. This could have fit easily inside of Herod's temple, easily, with tons of room to spare. Why do you think it was relatively small?
Is it because when the ark was in the tent was open and the people worshipped more on the perimeter on the outside? Because it wasn't enclosed.
Okay.
So is this kind of the same thing? Because when the temple will be finished, the worshiping will be outside.
That is exactly right. The people are going to be outside. The people are going to go into the temple. We're not talking about the temple being a place where people go in to worship. The temple is a place where what is in the temple? And this is what would be in any temple. What is in the temple? What's in the temple?
God.
Yes, that is exactly right. In fact, we're going to see that later, that when God enters the temple, God is in the temple. God doesn't need an enormous house. People aren't supposed to be in the temple. People are supposed to be on the outside. This is the dwelling place. This is truly God's house. And what we, even though there's a lot of detail offered, what we don't know for sure is whether the house was air conditioned. But it certainly was God's house. It was a dwelling place, so it doesn't have to be huge. Now, what's then described? So the temple dimensions are described. This is the size of the building, and then what's described. And I'm going through this slow. We're not going to go through all this stuff this slow. We're going to take huge bits because we don't need to, where they carve the pomegranates, we don't need to focus a lot of attention there. What is described after you describe the house?
The interior.
Okay, well, even before the interior, it describes the vestibule, the like the porch, and the porch is that's where the people are going to be, out in the courtyard. And inside now, after the porch, now, Judy, we're inside the building, right? And inside the building, you've got what? What's being described?
The holy place.
Okay, you got a holy place.
Inner room, that's called.
Okay, now, what? And the rooms are relatively small. These are little rooms. When you talk about a room that's 6 cubits wide, that's really small. That's not even a bedroom. That's a really tiny little room. You said that let's get to the Holy of Holies in just a little, that inner room. How is this big? So we've got this divided into rooms, the interior divided into smaller rooms. How is the whole building built? What's it built from? From what is it built? Okay, stone. And there's some very specific things about the stone that he mentions. And what does it say about the stone?
How big the stones were, how did they get them moved?
Okay, because they say, and that's interesting, because they said about the stones, what did they say
They
about?
were just in the quarry.
In the quarry, they were cut.
Because no hammers or anything were used building the temple.
Okay, why do you think that was the case? Why do you think they didn't have, they didn't just bring the raw stone and?
Because it was sacred.
Okay, this is sacred
Respect
space, and it
God.
shows respect and such. Okay, and then a lot of detail about the cedars and the rafters and stuff. Now, so the outline of the temple is mentioned in the middle of this description. What comes to Solomon? What does Solomon? Who starts speaking to Solomon after the sort of the basics of the temple design? Who begins to speak to Solomon?
The Lord.
Okay, the Lord starts speaking to Solomon. And what does the Lord say to Solomon?
If he listens to his decrees and carries out his regulations, keeps all the commands and obeys them, he'll fulfill through you the promise he gave to David, his father.
Okay, so what is he making with Solomon?
Covenant.
Okay, he's making another covenant with Solomon. And why does this covenant become important? Because what is Solomon doing right here? What is Solomon? What is the writer been telling us that Solomon is doing? He's building.
He's following the word of God.
Yeah,
It's to
by
worship.
by building this temple, right? And so when the Lord says to Solomon, "I'm going to be with your people," the meaning is slightly different, given the fact that Solomon is building the Lord a house, right? Mm-hmm. So by this covenant, how is the Lord going to be with his people? I mean, he's been with his people because he was in that tent that they carried around through the wilderness. How is he going to be with his people now? How might we be seeing a shift in the way Israel and Judah saw the presence of God? Where is God going to be?
In the temple.
God's going to be in the temple. That's where
And
God's
he
going
won't
to
be
be.
moving around like
He's
the
not gonna
ark
be-
was before.
He is not going to be moving around. He is going to be with his people because he is going to be in the temple. Now, that's what this writer is telling us. The writer in Chronicles tells us the exact same thing, only more details in Chronicles, if you can believe it. There's a lot of details in Chronicles about how they worshiped. This then is saying for Jewish worship, the temple is huge, is a huge deal, because the temple is where God dwells. Now, that's not unusual for ancient people. That's why they built temples, because that's where you could go and meet God. You met God, your gods, in their temple. This is the Israelites are doing the same thing, but it is a departure from what they've done in the past, where God is a God that moves around. It's also different than the way we see God as being omnipresent. You don't have to be in church to encounter God. You can encounter God anywhere. Well, that's not what ancient people located God in a place. And this is what God is establishing. So the covenant is now not just, I'm going to be with you in some broader sense. I'm going to be with you because you'll be able to see me and meet me by going to the temple. Now that's going to be a real big problem for the people when Israel and Judah become separate countries, because that means the place to encounter God for the people of Israel, which will be the other country. Jerusalem is in Judah. It means the temple's in Judah. For the people of Israel to worship God, they've got to go into another country to do it. That's not going to work out real well. You don't want to be protected by a God who lives somewhere else. You want to be protected by a God who is with you. It's not, especially when you're fighting the people, when you're fighting Judah, you don't want to go and you can't go into Judah to worship God when you're at war with Judah. That's going to be a problem. But we're going to start that kind of next couple of weeks. Okay, so we've got this established. Now, after it's established, therefore, we know this temple is really, really going to be important. This is kind of crucial now to this new covenant. The writer starts describing the inside. And how is the inside described?
Everything seems to be covered with gold.
Oh, everything is covered with gold. You got cedar carved and it's covered with gold. And in this description, now we've got this sanctuary, this most holy place. And what is going to make this the most holy of places? What's going to make this the holy of holies? Why? Why is it?
God's there.
Because that's where God dwells. That's where God is, in this house. Now, in most religions, and all religions have this in their temple, what would they have in this holy place where God dwells? What would they put in there? What would you expect if we were worshiping another religion? Greek mythology, Roman mythology, ancient mythology, another religion, the people of Phoenicia or the Philistines. What would we expect to be in that part of the temple?
Statue.
We would expect a statue, right? We'd certainly expect an altar because you'd have to perform sacrifice, but you'd certainly expect a statue. Now, the people didn't believe the statue was God. Nobody believed the statue was God, but they did believe the statue represented God. And therefore, when you came close to the statue, you could feel close to God. So they weren't worshiping the statue, but the statue became sort of a vehicle by which you could feel close to God. That's why it's called an idol, because it brings you closer to God. And that, by the way, is one of the reasons, but why in Judaism, well, let's erase that. So that statue brought you closer to God. Now, in this Holy of Holies that the Jews have, in the temple, are you going to be able to put a statue of God? Can you put a statue of the Lord God in the Holy of Holies? Just build him a statue of that. Well, the people of Israel had problems with that, right? With Moses in the wilderness, right? Because that's what they asked Aaron when Moses was on the mountain. Said, we're away from Egypt. We're really scared out here. Moses tells us the God is out there somewhere on mountains and stuff. But we're scared. We need what? A physical representation of God. We need something to remind us that God is with us. We got nothing to remind us that God is with us. So, we'd like you to do what? They asked Aaron, what do we want you to do?
Build an idol.
Build us a representation of God. Not, this isn't what God looks like, but give us something that can connect us with the God who is protecting. So as long as we can look at this, we know God is close. Now, you say, oh, well, that's not terrible. Well, I served a church when I was out in Montana, and it had a great big picture of Jesus that we had on the wall. As soon as you walked into the sanctuary, there was a picture of Jesus, and it was there because people said when children saw it, they would get quiet. They'd look at the picture of Jesus and know they were in the presence of God. That's what idols do. They remind us we're in God's presence. That's why Reformed Christians have always been real nervous about big pictures of Jesus, because it kind of functions like an idol. That picture is not divine. It may connect you to the divine, but should it? Should it? Does that picture have power? Well, that's what they said. And of course, what was the result of them worshiping the calf, this sign of God's presence? What was God's judgment on them doing this? Was God happy that they built a calf to remind them of Him? No, He was not flattered that, they were going to carry this calf around to remember that He wasn't flattered by that, right? And in fact, He told them they had to grind it up and mix it with water, and they had to drink it, all this gold. It was bad scene. So God was not pleased that they had done this, because idolatry is wrong. And that's 10 Commandments wrong. So you can't put in a statue of God. You can't do it. That's a graven image. So in this Holy of Holies, you can't do what other peoples would do. That's why in the Parthenon, there was a huge statue of Athena in Athens, because you could go in look in the Parthenon, by gum, you're in the presence of Athena, because that's her statue right there. Can't do that with God. So what do they end up having to do in this Holy of Holies? What do they put in there?
2-winged creatures.
Okay, they're going to put in 2 winged creatures. Now, are those creatures described in detail? Well, they got wings, right? But really don't know what they look like. And nobody knows what they look like. Speculation. Who knows what they look like? But these 2 winged creatures are going to be in the Holy of Holies. What else is going to be in there? What else is going to be in this Holy of Holies? The ark is going to be there. It's going to be between these winged creatures. And that's going to be a reminder of God's presence. So it's not a statue, but it's going to be an ark. And what is in the ark?
Moses' tablets.
Moses' tablets, which tells us that what becomes really important, rather than a graven, a created image of God, what represents to them God's presence with His people. If it's an ark with the tablets in the ark, what represents God's presence with His people? If ancient people could look at a statue of Jupiter and say, I'm in the presence of Jupiter, or Athena, I'm in the presence of Jupiter, or Moloch, I'm in the presence of Moloch. He's here with me. I can see his statue, and therefore I know he's close. What serves that function for the people of Israel?
Presence of Moses?
Well,
His commandments.
His commandments,
Oh.
yes, but that's why I had to hesitate. So yeah, kind of, but it's the commandments. It's not Moses as sort of a Messiah or a God-man, but it's in the commandments that God gave. So it's not in that image, rather it's in the law. The law becomes that representation of God. So the law, and like I said before, we're getting to a place where Israel is viewing God. There are three ways you can start seeing that God is present with us. One is by the law, which is the tablets in the ark. One is by the king, the Davidic king, and the other is by kind of land, but also focused in the temple on Zion. These become the images that a Jew can look to know that God is with them. Just like other people would use a statue, good night, or a picture. This is how a Jew would tell. That's why when the temple is destroyed and when the Davidic king no longer rules, you only have the law left. And so the Jews eventually are going to become more and more focused on law because that's all they've got. They don't have the other two signs. So it becomes that becomes their reminder. Okay. So we've got that. Now, after he describes what's going on in there, carvings on the wall and everything's covered, how long did it take him to build this temple?
7.
Okay, it took him 7 years to build the temple, and not a shocker that it's 7 years because 7 is a perfect number. So the temple is built. Now you go, man, we're done with the temple. We're not done with the temple. We got more temple stuff to do. But then the writer shifts. And where does he shift in chapter 7? After the temple has been constructed. So we get this layout of the temple. What does he start talking about at the beginning of chapter 7?
Solomon built
Okay,
his palace.
Solomon starts building
His house.
his house. And if the temple took 7 years, how long did it take to build his house? 13. Okay. And how is that house described?
It's bigger than.
It's bigger than the temple. It's bigger than the temple. What else? What is the connection with the temple?
It was built with some cedar.
Yeah, okay, it was built with cedar, same thing, same construction that the temple, used in the construction of the temple. As they start describing it, and there's a lot of details in terms of Solomon's palace, which shows that it must be important, although we haven't even started on the details with the temple, which shows that that's more important than Solomon's house. What are some of the things that sort of come to the surface, as you read the description of Solomon's house? Some things that might be a little interesting. It's big. What else becomes kind of interesting? He's got a wife, right?
Yeah, build her.
He builds her a house, right? And the writer tells us that he builds her a house. Now that's kind of interesting that the writer tells us that. Why might the writer mention that Solomon builds his wife that's connected to the main house, but builds her a house?
So she can still practice her beliefs. with
Well,
her
that's
house.
he doesn't perhaps. Okay, doesn't really say it, but that certainly is something we might start wondering.
Doesn't sound like if my husband built me a special place, it's like then you're not really together.
Yeah.
In everything,
Right.
supporting each other.
Yeah, and I think the writer's too good. He's too good a writer not to be aware of it. That maybe he's planting a seed that's going to grow later. He doesn't really mention it other than he built it for her. But that's interesting.
It's odd.
Yeah, that's not just that it's there, but that the writer would mention it. Because remember, anything he mentions is expensive. I mean, he's not just shooting off on nice to know information. This is stuff that he considers crucially important, or he wouldn't have mentioned it. So I think he's kind of dropping this in as a reminder that, Solomon had a foreign wife. He's going to have more than one, but he has a foreign wife. Not a good Jewish girl, but the daughter of Pharaoh. That's kind of interesting. Now, what's the proximity of his palace to the temple? Where does Solomon's palace stand with respect to the temple? The palace was connected. There was a connection. It was next door, right next to the temple. So you had the temple, and then you had Solomon's palace, and there was a connection between the two. Now now why would the palace be connected to the temple? Now not like a hallway, but they were, because the temple was freestanding. But why would the palace be so close, right next to the
Which
temple?
shows significance of the king depending on the Lord.
Okay, that this is the king and the temple that encloses the law. All three of those are connected together. They're really close together. So there's an intention there. Now this is going to be a big deal later when Herod builds his temple. And like I said, Herod's temple was huge. It was 70 years to build. It was enormous. That was the temple that Jesus was wandering around. But when Jesus was around it wasn't finished. It wasn't going to be finished yet. It was still under construction. And after it had been finished for like 6 years, the Romans were going to tear it down. This huge temple. They're going to tear it down. And in fact, in Jerusalem, where they talk about the Temple Mount and the Wailing Wall, that's associated not with Solomon's temple, but it's going to be associated with Herod's temple. That's one of the supporting walls to Herod's temple later, that the Jews are still going to be. And this is the first temple. Herod's is the third temple. There's going to be another temple in between Solomon's temple and Herod's. So the Jews are going to build a couple of temples three temples on this land. The second temple is going to be really modest.
So
If this is
these
modest, it's going to be really
temples are
modest.
Still, there's no remains of them?
Other than that supporting
Those
wall.
big stones and all that?
Other than when the Romans tear the temple down, they tear the temple down. And that's one of the things that you could almost date the Gospel of Luke, because in the Gospel of Luke, Jesus says, doesn't say it in Mark, but he says in Luke, that when they look at the temple, and he says, this is going to be brought down, one stone will not be left on another. And that's exactly what the Romans are going to do. And why would the Romans do it? Why would the Romans do it?
God.
If God is present there, the temple, if I believe God is present there, that can be a place where I can focus my attention. This can be kind of a rallying cry. Sometimes it can be a person, sometimes it can be a thing, a building. You tear that building down, ancient people, where is God? He ain't there anymore. And so the Romans building, the only thing they have left is a supporting wall. And that's where the Jews make their prayers, do their prayers. Now, there's a mosque. The Dome of the Rock is on temple ground, but it's there not to show disrespect to the Jews, but actually to show respect. Because Islam and Judaism, there's a connection between the two. They're both Semitic, they both claim a common history. So the fact that they would build a mosque on the place where the temple it's actually showing their respect for the importance of that location, not as a way to denigrate it or to show that it's that it's worthless. This isn't a shot at the Jews. This is to show that we all worship the same God. Therefore, a mosque on this temple site is showing respect to God. That's good. But, of course, that's not the way it's viewed by some now. But yeah, that's Judy. That's all that's left. And none of the furnishings are there. Well, something else that's really important always to keep in mind, and we see this in the ancient world a lot. When buildings, the material that goes to make buildings, it's really valuable. We're not in a time when there's a lot of stuff around. That's why the cedars are so important. Emphasize. We had to get timber. People don't think about, well, I'm going to build a house. Gee, where am I going to get the timber? There's just not enough of it. We'll find it. There's plenty of the timber around. In the ancient world, that wasn't the case. Building materials, that was really valuable. And so if you had stones from a quarry, that was really, really important. So if you pulled down a building, you didn't just throw it in the dump. You took the stones and you did what with them? Reused them. Cut them up, reused. You reuse the stones. And that's why a lot of times in the ancient world, you don't have, good gracious, incredible cities like Rome and Athens. You think, oh man, there should be all kinds of buildings. They aren't, because when they tore when a building came down, people would tear a building down just to get the building materials and take the stones and build something else. It's really fascinating what they do, what they have to do in the ancient world, and particularly during the Middle Ages, after the ancient period when people really didn't have anything. Man, they were tearing stuff down right and left to build a hovel, to live in, because there was just nothing else to use. So you cannibalized other things, and you didn't appreciate the history because you were trying to survive. So who cares that this was 1,000 years old? I don't have a place to live. I got to build something. So you're right. These huge stones, the Romans tore them down, and then they were used for other things. So they ceased to exist, except that one supporting wall that's still there. Okay, so Solomon builds his house connected to the temple, and then we immediately go back to the temple, and we've got chapter 7. What do we get in chapter 7? If you've got headings in your Bible, what's the heading?
The temple furnishings.
The temple furnishings, right? And in the temple, what are some of the furnishings? And we don't need to go through all of them in detail, although you can if you want. What are the furnishings, some of the furnishings in the temple?
There was all kinds of bronze work.
All kinds of bronze stuff being built. What else do we have? So we got these pillars out by the door, these huge pillars that are given names, that are outside the door, the entrance way into the temple. What else do you have in terms of furnishings? In verse 23, what's mentioned?
The sea of cast metal, circular in shape.
Yeah, they call it the molten sea. And what is that?
Where the sacrifices were going to take place?
No.
No, it held 10,000 gallons.
It was a
enormous.
huge basin that had an enormous amount of water. Now, why? It was supported on 12 ox. And the details on how it's made. What is the and it stood outside the temple.
Oh, for them to wash?
You'd think so, but no. It becomes it becomes a symbol, a representation of God's authority over the world. We've got the oxen, the 12, which also are the 12 signs of the zodiac, and 12 is a big deal in 12 tribes. 12 oxen, they're facing the four directions, which, that's an earthly thing. This becomes kind of a symbol for the world, God's creation, connected to God's creation. Because the creation comes out of water, comes out of chaos. So this becomes a tangible reminder of what God has done in the world. That's what this molten sea represented. They really didn't use it. But the fact that they use water becomes kind of important because, again, keep on going back to the ancient world, water is precious. Therefore, this is being fed by one of the springs that's feeding Jerusalem. Part of that water is being diverted to supply this huge basin that's just sitting there full of water. It becomes sacrificial because you're sacrificing something you desperately need to fill this basin. It's a sign of dedication. Now, it's interesting. Latter-day Saints view it in a very different way. The Mormons believe that the Jews baptized in this molten sea, and therefore they baptized, that baptisms were being done in the ancient temple. And Mormons say that's why in their temples baptized, and in every Mormon temple you're going to find a huge basin like this because they claim this as a sign that points forward into the New Testament. There's no indication that the Jews baptized in this, that they used it for cleansing. It was more based on other ancient writings. It was more, and the writings here, which certainly would have mentioned it, that it was just sort of there as sort of a symbolic, like any of the other furnishings. So, but it was there, but it had a huge amount of water, which again in the ancient world is kind of sacrificial. You got all kinds of stands and carved things. Now again, why is there so much detail? Why is there? Have we run into this kind of detail before? And just as an aside, this particular writer doesn't do a huge amount of detail. In other things he's written, he hasn't gone into a huge amount of detail. Have we run into this kind of detail before? Clearly we have, because I wouldn't have asked the question if we hadn't. We have run into it. Do you remember when we've run into this? Yes, the building of the ark and the building of the tent. Way back in Numbers, when they were talking about in Exodus, when they were building the ark and the tent, there were all kinds of descriptions, even down to how do you build the rings that the pole slid through, and the materials for the tent, and the priests, the details and what the priests wore when they went to the tent of meeting. So there were details, a lot of details there. The division of the land is another example of a huge amount of detail, where the borders would be. So they have done it. Each time they've done these details, what has it shown? What do those things, if we're looking at the ark and the tent of meeting, if we look at the division of the land in Joshua, when we look at the temple here, and like I said, there are more details, particularly on worship, in the books of the Chronicles, because they were really obsessed with details.
These are God's instructions.
These are God's instructions, and man, this stuff is important. The temple is important. The temple is important. The worship of God is important. It was to the writer, which means it was to the people who were receiving this. That having this is absolutely crucial. Okay, now when the people are reading, a lot of this stuff didn't exist anymore. Because we're going to read in the story of Kings that one of the things that the kings will do later to pay bribes to other kings, we're going to attack you unless you, because we're still talking about a world where people are raiding, kings raid one another. We're going to attack you unless you make it in our interest not to. So you pay us and we won't attack you. And where are future kings going to get the money to pay? They're going to take some of the gold stuff from the temple. they're going to use some of the temple stuff to pay off other kings. And we're going to see that over and over again. The kings are going to start peeling the gold off the wall to pay, Pharaoh, or pay the king of Assyria, or pay the king of Syria, to pay somebody to not attack. We're going to ship off some of the stuff, some of the lampstands, some of the bases. We're going to ship those off as a payment. So but the people who are reading this, the emphasis is on how glorious this temple is. So the temple is finally built. Chapter 7 is furnished. What's going on in chapter 8? We got the end in chapter 7. The temple is done. The conclusion of the work. How does he describe the conclusion of the work? The writer.
King Solomon brought in the things his father David had dedicated,
Okay.
the silver and gold furnishings, and placed them in the treasuries of the Lord's temple.
Okay, so everything is in there. Chapter 8, what does Solomon do now that the temple is finished?
The ark's brought to the temple.
Now it's time to move the Ark of the Covenant into the temple. And how do they bring the Ark who brings the Ark into the covenant, into the temple?
The priest.
The priests and the Levites, right? Just the way they're supposed to. Bring the Ark. Now, why is that so important that the Ark is being brought into the temple? Why is this so crucial that the Ark that has been in this tent, since David moved it into Jerusalem, was in a garage for a while. It was just out in a shed for a long period of time. Spent a little time in the land of the Philistines. Why is it such a big deal that they bring the Ark into this temple?
Because that's where it's going to reside. It's not going to move around.
It is not going to move around anymore. It's going to be stable in this place because this is where God dwells. And as soon as they bring the Ark, and he tells us the Ark contains the 2 tablets of stone, the law, what happens as soon as the Ark enters the house of the Lord? What occurs there? We got light, we got cloud, we got, in Hebrew, the word is kavod. The kavod. And kavod in Hebrew can mean cloud or it can mean glory. Depends on context. Kind of carries both because the kavod, the glory, the cloud, that shows the presence of God. And so when the Ark comes into the temple, the cloud fills. A cloud fills the temple, which is the presence, the glory of God. Fills. So what's occurred to the temple?
God is there.
God is there. And it isn't the people who make it sacred. It's the Lord coming on the temple that makes it sacred. Just as an aside, whenever you run into cloud in the New Testament, generally cloud represents the same thing it represents here. Represents glory. So when it talks about on Transfiguration, a cloud surrounded them, Jesus, when he was talking to Moses and Elijah, they were surrounded by a cloud. That's kavod. That's glory of God. When it talks about Jesus being at ascension, being taken into the clouds, kavod, glory of God. It's not necessarily the fluffy white clouds. It is the glory. He's taken into the glory of God. That's why when he talks about him coming back, comes back in the clouds. Kavod, glory of God. So it's that sense of glory. That's why when God led the children of Israel through the wilderness, they followed a pillar of cloud during the day. That's the kavod. They followed the glory of God so God guided them through the wilderness. Does it have a physical meaning? Well, maybe. It certainly has a theological meaning. So when this cloud fills, God, in a sense, is making this house sacred. And what does Solomon say?
He was giving praises to the Lord.
Okay, he's giving praises. This is where you are going to dwell. Now, again, this represents a huge shift in Jewish theology. Because instead of God being in a place that's designed to be mobile, now God is going to be grounded in one place. In a sense, they become more like the nations that surround them, not less. Because the nations that surround them all have their gods dwelling in a place. And that's what the Jews. So in some ways they're becoming very similar to the other gods. It also reflects a change in their material situation. Because now they aren't moving around anymore. They are local. And if they are grounded into this area, how are they probably earning a living? How are they surviving as they become more grounded in this land? What are they doing to survive? How are they making a living if they're in this land? Maybe better than that, how did they used to live? How did the people of Israel, when you look at Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, what were they? Remember what they were? By profession. They were herders. And if you're herders, what do you have to do? You got to move. If you're herders, you got to move around a lot. And you need a God that's going to move with you, right? If you become centralized in land and you build an administrative system and you secure the borders and you put a temple in the middle of your land and your God is going to dwell in that temple and that's going to be your capital city and the palace is right next to it and the king is going to issue judgments from his throne room. You are now in the land, right?
And self-sufficient.
How are you going to be self-sufficient? What are you probably going to be doing?
When King Solomon divided up, had all the lands and all the governors, they all did different things. And they
Right.
all sent their goods
Right.
into the city,
Right.
and into him.
Okay, how are those goods? What are people producing when you're settled in the land? Are you still herders? Do you just kind of wander around?
Growing food.
Okay, you're doing what?
Growing food.
Growing food, which means you become
Farmers.
farmers, right? You're producing food. You're not wandering around following cattle anymore. You're not looking for green pastures and still waters anymore. What you're doing is you're looking for what? You're not looking for green pastures. You're looking for fertile land. You're looking for fertile soil. That the people are changing here. They're becoming more settled in a land. And that's just to sort of file away. The temptation is going to be to start worshiping the gods that are worshipped by people who live on land, who are seeking fertile. You don't necessarily follow a God that's going to lead you to green pastures and to still waters. You don't want that to worship that God anymore, because you don't want a God that's going to move you away from your farm to something else. You want a God that's going to do what? Make the soil fertile, to bring rain when it's appropriate, to stop rain when it's not. You're going to start worshiping the gods of nature, these natural gods that control natural cycles, and that's going to be the temptation that the people are going to face because they've settled in the land. They're going to start facing the temptation of worshiping the gods that keep the storms away and make the land fertile. And that's not the God that leads people to different places. Is with you as you move your flocks. And that's going to be the temptation to move away from this God who now dwells in the temple. Okay, so, but this is, and we get this is nothing but positive here. We don't have to see anything negative. You know, he is being very sincere, and in fact, what does he say? We got the assembly of the people there. What does he say to the people?
He blessed them.
Okay, he blesses all the people there, and as he blesses them, he gives them a little bit of history, right? Mm-hmm. Like this is a culmination of their history, and after he blesses the people with this, where does Solomon turn his attention, like in verse 22?
Prayer of dedication.
Okay, now he turns his attention to God, and he's there before the altar of the Lord, and he starts doing what? What does he begin doing in verse 23?
The God of Israel, there's no God like you in heaven above or on earth below.
What is he doing?
Praising him.
He's praising him, right? He's praising God. And he describes God, and how does he describe God?
Keeps his covenant with all his servants.
That becomes really interesting, because as he goes through this prayer, as he prays related to God and prays related to the people, what is Solomon doing in this long, long, long prayer? That's really detailed. Because even when he prays for the people, what is Solomon doing in this prayer?
Is it reviewing the covenant?
Okay, good. He's reviewing the covenant. In a sense, he's putting into words the covenant. And remember, covenants have two sides. This is what God is going to do. This is what we're going to do. If we do this, God will do this. If God does this, we'll do that. Okay, that's what a covenant is. And that's what he's doing in this prayer. You know, he's laying out the covenant. This is what God has promised to us. And this is what we're going to do. This is our promise to God. This is God's promise to us. This is our promise to God. When have we seen covenants like this made before? When have we seen covenants like this before?
It's in there, but it doesn't.
Yeah.
Not a shocker. One time was when the people came into the land. After Joshua divided. Remember, he stood on a mountain and all the people were there. And he articulates this covenant at the end of the book of Joshua. We've got the covenant with Moses bringing the law down. Covenant between you. God's going to be with you. And these are the laws we're going to follow. In the two places where I talked about where we have these details mentioned, we've got this covenant reestablished, and we see it again. Just like when they received the law, including the worship law, when they received the land with Joshua, when they received the temple, a covenant, a detailed covenant is articulated, and that's what we've got right here. Now, why does that become so important at the time? Why is this important in this context? What do we see? What is happening here that is really important and dramatic?
Because the God's law is at the center, and that's what's in the temple.
Okay, good. The temple has been brought into this. Brought in with the law and brought in with the land. The temple is now part of this because it's being made here. How does this become important to people later? Why is this? Because the people who are reading this, they would be reading this 400 years after this has occurred. Why would it be important for them?
Because it doesn't change.
Okay, it doesn't change. From their perspective, though, does the temple look the way it did when Solomon opened it? When we get all these details about the carving and the gold and all the different basins and lampstands and the two pillars. And the temple that the people are looking at here doesn't look like that anymore, because kings have been stripping it down to pay other kings to avoid being attacked. Why does it become so important for them? In other words, why would the writer go into so much detail in telling people later that this is what was established at the temple?
The covenant always remains under the temple, doesn't it?
The covenant always remains. And if I believe the covenant remains, and this is a covenant between us and God, and things have declined, why? Why have things declined? Why does the temple no longer look the way it did? If this is a covenant God makes with us, and remember, covenant has two sides. Covenant isn't God's going to do everything, we can do whatever we want.
The people broke parts of the covenant.
That the people broke parts of the covenant. And when we read his history, we're going to read a lot of times people are breaking the covenant. The covenant, so it's not going to be on God's side. This isn't because God turned away from them. It's going to be they turned away from God, and they're going to pay consequences. God is still going to be there, but they're going to pay the consequences for their actions. Okay? So it becomes really important that this becomes kind of that this is a golden age when Israel is united as a country under Solomon, and we've got the temple opened, and it is absolutely gorgeous, and people are excited. Oh, and by the way, what does Solomon do after he does these prayers?
Dedicates the temple.
He dedicates the temple. And how does he dedicate the temple? As I'm sure y'all did when you opened this building.
Sacrifice.
He sacrificed 22,000 oxen. So I'm assuming that y'all did the same sort of thing.
In my mind.
Sacrificed 22,000 oxen and 120,000 sheep. So it was a bloody mess around the temple. And by the way, the altar where they do the sacrifice wasn't in the temple. It was outside.
Where the sea and...
Yeah, where you had the molten sea and you had the why would it be outside?
It's messy.
Yeah, absolutely it's messy. Remember, the temple's pretty small. It's a relatively small. You couldn't get 120,000 sheep in that little bitty building. So it was outside, and sacrifices were being done 24/7. We're not talking about that sacrifices were offered one day a week or on special occasions. At the temple, sacrifices were being done all the stupid time, all the time. That's why you had to have priests there all the time, because that's what priests did. They performed sacrifice. So the temple was a
mess.
It was a bloody mess. Outside the temple was a mess. As priests were constantly killing things on the altar. And by the way, just why would killing an oxen? Why would that be considered a sacrifice? Why would they kill sheep and oxen?
Because that provided for the people.
Yeah, that was something that had real genuine value. So if I were going to present a sheep, this means I'm taking something away from my family. This becomes something really difficult for me to do. I am making a sacrifice. I am sacrificing something for God. It wasn't so much that God was a bloodthirsty God. I'm sacrificing something that is essential to me, to God, and not doing it in the expectation I was going to get 2 sheep back, but I was doing it because I was showing respect to God. I'm not sure that animal sacrifices would be what we would do now, but there are things that may be comparable. Money may be comparable, because that becomes the means by which we buy food. We don't grow it. We don't raise sheep. We buy it. So that may be more in line. So animal sacrifices, that's why they did it. Okay. So we've got the temple is now dedicated, right? Israel has another focus. They've got this law, they've got the king, and they've got this temple, right? Situated in the land. They know right now that God is what?
With them.
God is with them. And if they have any doubt, they can do what? Go to the temple.
Sacrifice.
That's right. Or they can look at the king. Or they can obey the law. If there's any doubt that God is with them, boom. If you wanted to look at Israel, describe Israel, right now, Israel is at its height, is at its very peak. And when you're at your very peak, you can always go up.
Nope.
No.
Usually
You generally, you can't go up when you're at a peak. And right now, Israel's at its peak. We've got little indications of problems. Pharaoh's daughter, who has her own little house, that could be a problem. Kings that are become kind of arbitrary, that could be a problem.
We can't live in utopia until we're with God.
Until we're with God, yes, that's right. And one of the things I find so interesting in this is they could have written their history like that. I mean, they could have written their history. If you've ever read the book of Acts, have you ever read the book of Acts? Acts is a great book. But Acts is written about 60 years after the events in Acts took place. Because the events in Acts is a church. And one of the things that you find fascinating in Acts is in Acts, everybody gets along. Everybody gets along. Well, we don't get along, Christians don't get along with the Jews, Jewish opposition. But once Jews become Christians, we all get along in Acts. All the sermons are the same. There's one controversy which we resolve and everybody leaves happy. The church is growing by thousands of converts. This is a glorious time. And even at the end, after Paul is arrested and is in Rome, it says he's sort of under house arrest, but he's entertaining visitors. They don't restrict visitors to him. So he's preaching the gospel. That's how it ends, preaching the gospel without limitation in the capital of the world, in Rome. It is a glorious story. They could have written their story, and I think the purpose is Luke is writing to a church that is struggling and is telling them, look, this is the way the church began. If they can have this kind of faith, you can too. With the Holy Spirit and all, you can do the same thing. Powerful lesson. We know it's not, because in Paul's letters, he doesn't talk about everybody getting along. There's a lot of stuff going on in the early church that Paul says is problematic. He could have done the same thing, but he didn't. He didn't write this glorious story about how wonderful everything is. This writer is writing about a God who is with an imperfect people. And I find that absolutely amazing. And maybe it can resonate with us as we deal with how are we imperfect in the sight of God. How do we function as an imperfect people, knowing that God loves us? So that's how we're going to, from this point on, we're going to start slipping. We're going to just like it was with David. David.
History repeats itself with the slips.
That's what it does, because people don't change. People have done the same thing forever. Okay. Any questions? Okay, let's have a word of prayer. Lord God, thank you so much for giving us the opportunity to go through this. Remind us that the glory reflected in this temple is a glory that you reflect to the world. But remind us that your presence isn't limited to a building. It isn't limited to a practice. It isn't limited to a people. Your presence is everywhere. It encompasses all things. And just remind us that in spite of this glorious place, we can encounter your love and your power and authority everywhere. In the name of Christ we pray. Amen.